We will pick up right there where Caleva left us. Thank you.
No pressure then. I've now got to make you all laugh, which might not happen. I've actually come as a stand-in for Mauricio, who can't be with us today. But Mauricio and I have been working on some things together, so it's not such a bad transition. That's me. We don't want to look at that, do we? Really? That's much better. Okay, so the thing I'd like to say first of all, I actually can't see any of you, which is kind of cool. The thing I'd like to say first of all is that I don't believe that all stories need to be built out to be a vast story world. I work with writers, publishers, broadcasters, filmmakers, studios, game designers, many of which have fantastic ideas, many of which don't have any intention of building their stories out to anything larger than one book, one TV series, or one film. And I think that it's a consideration that you need to take early on as to whether you have a story that actually has big enough potential to be built into a story world. You can see from some of the processes that Raimo and Juan and Jorg have shown us that it's a very complex process to build a story world from a story. However, there are some fantastic stories that I've been presented with that are quite small in their initial presentation, but have fantastic potential to be something more. So I know this is kind of looking at animation, really, but I just think that whether it's animated, audio, 3D, or stories around the campfire, transmedia is not a quick fix. It's definitely an approach to telling stories. And really, I'm going to take you right back to story, because I think it's been made quite clear that a strong story world can come alive in many forms across multiple media and is at the central core and heartbeat of storytelling. So I just think that what we should think of is some nice quick processes that we can use to actually pull out the hotspots that make a good story. But the thing I think hasn't been really discussed is the role of the audience, because things have changed massively in terms of how we interact with our audience. There's a friend of mine, Brian Seth Hurst, who's done some research in America that looked at this evolution of conversation between storyteller and audience, and actually came up with 4 different levels of interaction. The first is the broadcast model, which very much is the push model, which is kind of what we've had up until now. The stories are pushed out and we kind of put our fingers in our ears and don't listen back to the feedback. But there's another 3 levels after that. There's the level of to show that you're listening to your audience. And Brian actually assigned this to the way John Chu approached the Legion of Extraordinary Dancers, where he was very active on Twitter, and he was listening back to what the fans liked and didn't like. He didn't actually necessarily change anything too massively, but he showed that he was listening. The next level after that was the Welcome to My World, which he accrued with Tim Kring and his approach to Heroes, where the fan wiki for Heroes became so well documented, it actually became a reference tool for the writers. So he opened up this dialogue where the fans actually actively were adding things to help the writers continue their continuity of storytelling. And then the 4th level, which is the most scary, he assigned to Eric Kripke with Supernatural, especially in the later seasons of that, where he called this the Welcome to My World, and please feel free to take it. So the fans actually were adding canon to the story. So I think that in building a story world, for me anyway, it needs to be more than a glorified hobby. It has to be something that's commercially viable and something that you can take to market. And you can see from some of the processes that the other guys have shown, this is a big, big time-consuming task. It requires a core team to help you build a tight story world that allows the viewers, users, players, audience, whatever that word might be now, to the freedom to co-create and play and consume. And talking about playfulness, there's a lot of talk about gamification. I personally don't go with that term, because I think that assumes that everything has to have a game made from it, or there needs to be some kind of game attached. But I don't think that's what it should be. I think it should be fun. I think if you're asking your audience or your readers or fans or whoever they might be to engage with your story on a level that requires more commitment than just reading or viewing, it has to be fun. It might be a really sad story, but make what they're doing fun. It doesn't have to be a game, but make it fun. The bottom line is this: it has to be story-centric and not platform-centric. I think with such a host of free platforms that we can all use to tell our stories immediately, I've seen a big kind of gold rush to these platforms to try and tell the stories. And the danger is, like Raimo said, he's seen many failures. I have too, because of this. People aren't going back to story enough and considering the core components and the design elements of a great story. So in line with everybody else's processes, I also have my own. I teach a transmedia masterclass for the European Broadcasting Union, which I think covers, I might be wrong here, about 75 members of broadcasters across Europe. And that actually puts me in a really nice position because I get to see a lot of cultural stories being told. So as Raimo was saying about the Finnish stories that they're actually bringing to life, I've seen examples of that happen in Estonia and in Malta. And they have these fantastic historical mythologies that go back thousands of years that none of us know. But the people from those countries know them. And in using this transmedia approach, they're able to bring them to life in really exciting ways. So in order for me to teach this masterclass at EBU, I've had to develop my own process. And bear in mind, sometimes I'm speaking to broadcasters who interrupt me and say something like, "My dear, I've been working in broadcast for 30 years. There's nothing you can tell me about story." At which point I have to remind her, because it's normally a her, that they need a close eye on their audience. And the audience behaviours now will impact what they do. So here's my process. I've kind of gone into a little bit of a kind of roundabout way, which probably says something about the way my brain works. But I make them start with the theme of the story. That's that heartbeat right in the middle. The core theme, the core heartbeat of the story. Without knowing that, I believe it's difficult to actually be able to move on. And I'm actually working now on my 5th story. I come from a novelist and playwright background. It's taken me a year to figure out what the core theme of my story is. I kept thinking I'd found it, and then I'd get to the point where it just wasn't feeling right. And that moment it actually clicked. I realised that my core theme resonates with every one of my characters in different ways. And I like to echo that core theme in the way I deliver the experiences that I want my audience to enjoy. So that's the first step. Consider that core heartbeat, that DNA, that theme of your story. Once they've done that, I ask them to look and to drop down to the story world and to start imagining what that story world might look like. And there's a lot of factors that echo much of what the other guys have said. The essence of the story, I ask them to come up with a log line, a one-liner that the whole team can use as a reminder of what exactly they're doing, what that theme of that story is. To consider the genre or the niche of the story, I'll talk in a little while about how the genre affects audience behaviours and audience expectations. The geographical landscape. There are some stories that are being told in the modern day, but to pluck them and set them in the future or set them in the past gives them more resonance. So imagine if we were pitched with the idea of a TV series about an advertising agency on Madison Avenue, we might kind of go, yeah, okay. And then they tell you they'll set that in the 1950s and 60s and you've got Mad Men, and the whole thing feels differently. So what I suggest to some of my students is that they take what they have as that premise of the story world and consider placing it on a different part of the map of a timeline. I ask them to look at the central characters. To have a really strong central character, I'll also talk about this in a while, is something that you can carry that character across story worlds. If you look at your story world as kind of a bucket or a container for a host of stories, you want a character that can jump across all of those. How your character behaves and character archetypes is really important too. People need to be able to connect and resonate with how this character might act. Then to consider the dramatic pressures and the conflicts within that story world, and also the timelines, the influencing points and beats, which I know the guys have already spoken about. So once they've built that up, I ask them to look at audience, define who their audience are. And that's actually sometimes quite surprising. I did a project for my master's degree in 2006, and I thought I knew who my audience were. It was kind of like a chick-lit rom-com type story. And I was surprised at the character getting so many emails from guys who were following the story. Now, they would never have bought my book and read it on the train or the bus, because it probably would have had a pink cover. But because they could read it online and they could follow the Pull-in Power YouTube channel I'd set up, they loved it. And the character of the story was getting emails from these guys offering her like weekends away in Venice and crazy stuff that they were saying. And I was never sure really if they were just kind of joking with me in the way that I was acting as a character or whether they were genuine. But I made a point of always replying in character. So figure who your audience are. How will they behave? Will they look for clues? Are they passive? I found that my audience were very passive. And when I asked them near the end of my story to jump up and help me define who this woman should end up with, it was like ghost town. There were tumbleweeds rolling down that road. Nobody wanted to join in. And I hadn't set it up early enough that I was actually going to ask them to do something. I learnt loads of things from doing that wrong. Are they gamers? Is what you're asking them to do location-based? Will they be affected by the genre of the story? So for me, I was writing chick lit and rom-com, and I realised that the women didn't want to actually join in. Their attitude seemed to be, you know what, we do this every day, we go to work, we look after our kids, we cook dinner, we do all of these things. You're telling us the story. Don't ask us to do anything. I had no idea it would be like that. And probably from what I'd learnt from that, I would now set it up differently. Women are a tough market to write for. So then once I've asked you to consider your audience and look at the experience you want to deliver, how much of that is lean forward, how much of it is lean back? Be very mindful of what you're asking them to do or expecting of them. And only then I ask my students to look at platforms. And usually at the beginning of this process, I ask all of them to pitch an idea, what they're working on. And usually Facebook and Twitter play a part. Often, by the time we get to the platform consideration, those two don't even hit the final mark. They've understood that their audiences might not be hanging out in them places. People are falling away from Facebook at an alarming rate. I've got 2 teenage boys, and they're just so not interested in it anymore. There's so many other ways that they're interacting with their friends. It's kind of getting to a point now where Facebook isn't cool. Some people will be horrified by that. And then we'd look round at timeline and rollout. Are you telling your story really, really pacily over 2 weeks? Or is this something you're going to deliver perhaps over 9 months or a year? Those pacing and timing issues are critical. So, to take a quick look at theme. It's very hard, I have found, to define that core theme. And sometimes I ask people to look at the 7 basic plots. So, for example, one of the basic plots is overcoming the monster. And there are 3 stories that fit into that basic plot, which I feel are quite different on the face of it. They are Jaws, Hansel and Gretel, and there's one I can't remember, Silence of the Lambs, okay? So each of those 3 are based around this basic plot of overcoming a monster. But yet the way they're told, the timelines they're set in, the genre that is applied to them, and even the audience to which they talk are completely different. So sometimes if it's difficult to really nail down that core theme, I would suggest looking back at the 7 basic plots and just seeing if one kind of feels right, just to kind of get you going. There are lots of different perspectives on the baseline of the theme of the movie Avatar. And this is the one that I go with. On the face of it, the story is about a fictitious world, Pandora, and the message seems primarily political as we watch the inhabitants of this beautiful world fiercely try to protect their environment and prevent the bulldozers from wiping them and Pandora out. However, the subliminal message of Avatar is the ability to see. The message and heart of the story is about seeing another world, way of life, an opening of eyes and minds to different and new ways to live and exist, and seeing life from another perspective. The recurring image for Avatar is the large green eyes. Of all the images that could have been used in marketing trailers, console games, for Avatar it's no coincidence that these images were chosen. And when you consider that notion of the ability to see, you think how it definitely affects Jack Sully, the guy who's the disabled kind of soldier in the wheelchair, and he goes into Avatar and he's suddenly free, but then as he integrates with them more, he starts to see things from a different point of view. And I think the only character that doesn't really get that treatment is the guy, and I don't even know, is it from the FDR or something, and he comes in to rip up Pandora, and they end up blasting him down. He's the only one, really, that doesn't actually be affected by that notion of being able to see things from a different point of view. So it's quite difficult to nail that down, but it's worth working on. Because once you've figured out that core heartbeat of your story and that core theme, it's easier to start building your story world. But we spoke about genre a while ago. And the genre will speak to the audience expectations of your story. So as I found with chick lit and rom-com, there were expectations of what they would do. Up to date, we've found a lot of transmedia stories are successful in the crime and sci-fi and thriller genres. And I believe that is because the very nature of those stories raise questions. Who did it? What happened? How did that guy go from there to there? There's a murdered body with a kind of a black glove perhaps beside it. And then we see the next scene of some guy driving down the street wearing only one black glove. There are a lot of holes within those kinds of stories that raise questions that we want to answer the clues for. So all the genres denote a specific type of audience or behaviour, and I think it's so important that you understand what your audience behaviours will be. Otherwise, you'll create these vast story worlds, and you're actually kind of working in quite an insular way. Because without considering who you're telling the stories to, you've maybe spent years on something that you don't have an audience for. So take, for example, Twilight. This is only one step removed from current-day settings. It's in an urban fantasy science fiction category, but it's an example of something that has quite low barriers to entry. So for people to engage and play within the world of Twilight, they only need to know a few things, one of which is the vampires don't die in the sunlight in Twilight. In a lot of other vampire movies and films, they do, but in Twilight they don't. So the barriers to entry are quite low, the learning curve is fairly flat. Equally with Harry Potter, there are a few things you need to learn about the mythology and the rules of Hogwarts, but this was told quite cleverly, because really Harry Potter could have been told solely within the confines of Hogwarts. But they took a big, big step back, and they built a story world out of that. We saw the Whomping Willow, the Black Lake, the Quidditch pitch, Hagrid's house, the Weasley's house. There's so much more of the world of Harry Potter we saw that on the face of it we perhaps didn't need to see. But it took us outside of the confines of Hogwarts and built it into a rich and ripe story world, with a core theme of story that we know how the characters behave. We know how each of those characters would behave if they were taken out of the Harry Potter stories, because they were so well written. Equally, someone like Jack Sparrow, we could pretty much pluck him from Pirates of the Caribbean and put him in any story, and we know exactly how he would behave. So to consider the dramatic pressures and conflicts, you need to see if there's enough to sustain your story world beyond one book or one film or whatever it might be. You need to know that there's enough there to build it out. So if you think of the TV series of Battlestar Galactica, there's the constant threat of the Cylons that can never be overcome but only escaped and evaded, versus something like a comedy story world of The Simpsons, where all its characters, circumstances, and antagonists have continual reset. So the Simpson family may overcome the failings of modern American society in every episode, but they can never win. And the comedy forces of the story world will always be reset. So there's always a new challenge for Homer and the family, because as much as they try to break through, they're never going to win against society because of the way they are. So the dramatic pressures need to be compelling, powerful, and sustainable, and they need to apply to the whole story world and generate high stakes. The core thing with storytelling is people need to care enough. If you don't make the stakes high enough, they don't care. And I've seen too many stories where that's not set up in advance. So you build this thing up and you expect people to come and join in, but the stakes aren't high. An example I love of layered storytelling that just ups the intensity at every turn is the stories of Lost. This could really have been a fictional version of Survivor, but they had very clever world-building strategies within this. So we never saw the island of Lost. So we were equally as lost as the Losties, because we could never actually kind of figure out our domain or where we were on the island, because it was all seen very much from that kind of ground level of where they were. But then there were things that happened within the story. So I think there was a treasure chest that was discovered at one point that made us realise that they weren't the only people on the island. And there were other things, other characters that they came across that made us realise at the same time as them that there was more going on. So it very cleverly layered out the intensity and built out the story world that we experienced that at the same time as they did. So it's very, very cleverly done, and it's definitely worth a look if you can actually dig into the stories of Lost. There's a lot of stuff online about that, of the world-building strategies that we used. So to then look at the timeline and the influencing beats and forks in the road. These are moments or events where the threshold is passed and from which there's no going back. I know that was already covered, so I won't talk about that for too long. So to even look at games, how they're telling fantastic stories. I mean, we've got Assassin's Creed, which I know has already been mentioned, and this is a very action-adventure, open-world, stealth video game series. But this is now 5 main games. This was set in the 15th and 16th century. But this comes from inspiration from a novel that was actually written in 1938. This is a fabulous story that Ubisoft have seen the power of building this out to further things. So we're looking at our audience now. This is what we need to do. Because building a universe does begin with story, but defining the genre, the message and that heartbeat and the core themes will impact on your audience behaviours. And you're always going to have layered audiences. You will always have advocates who love your story and will share and like and tell their friends. You will have evangelists that actually want to maybe join in and co-create with you. You will have what I always call gardeners, that people like to try and keep it tidy, but they don't actually actively want to do anything. But then you will always have disruptors. So be ready for them. They want to come in and graffiti over everything you've done and mess it up at every turn. And try to create an experience for them too. Don't let them come in and mess it up for you. You be ready for them and have something that they can do. So just as a quick finish up, I've been looking at my process lately, and I came across this book called Hit Lit. And this is called Cracking the Code of the 20th Century's Biggest Bestsellers. And this guy had taken sometimes they become a bestseller because of the speed at which they go up the ratings. But these are stories that have progressively remained on the best-selling list for years. And here are the 12 that he chose. And it's surprising how many of these have gone from book to movie. Gone with the Wind, there's 8 million sales. Peyton Place, To Kill a Mockingbird, Valley of the Dolls, The Godfather, The Exorcist, Jaws, The Dead Zone, The Hunt for Red October, The Firm, The Bridges of Madison County, and The Da Vinci Code. And I was quite surprised that some of them were there. But these are the things that he has pointed out that are commonly resonant with each one. And when I show you these, you will see how these also are resonant with not only my approach to story world building, but also to a lot of what you've already seen today. The Golden Country, they all have this story world of this landscape that's beyond just that one place that you see the story. There are hot buttons that raise controversy. You see a big picture, which is these colossal characters doing great things. There's an abundance of facts and information. There's often a secret society or something that we're not so aware of. Bumpkins versus slickers. So some stories have country people going to the city, and others have city people going to the country. There's always religion of some denomination in there. There are mavericks, heroes and heroines of these 12 bestsellers are always rebels, loners, misfits or mavericks. There's always a fractured family, and there's a lot of juicy parts. There's always one sexual encounter that changes the whole thing. So in looking at Gone with the Wind, we can see how this is also told very nicely between Atlanta and Tara. So it actually builds out a story world of 2 domains. Peyton Place gave us a short and crucial glimpse of Manhattan, but most of the novel took part in a semi-rural town of the title. To Kill a Mockingbird took us on a long wallow in backwater America with a lot of brief references to great cities beyond its limits. So the notion of the story world was there. The Valley of the Dolls takes us on a roller coaster ride through the uppers and downers of metropolitan life with plenty of conflict, strong characters and theme. The Godfather had a huge theme of family with a dramatic question. The first question the Godfather asks seems harmless enough. How will Michael Corleone resist being drawn into the family business? But once his father is the target of an assassination attempt, the family is forced into war, the question changes. So that core key question is very strong. The Exorcist, set in Washington, D.C. Jaws, the carefree island of Amityville is only a half-day's drive from Manhattan. But they've split Amityville into summer folk and winter folk. So you've got these different people that populate this place as the year changes. And you very much feel the differences between those 2 types of people. Stephen King's The Dead Zone very much focused around the theme of the American dream and the American nightmare. Tom Clancy's Head for Red October was full of facts about submarines. John Grisham's The Firm. The Bridges of Madison County had a very strong theme of sexual awakening and what could have been. And the Da Vinci Code opened up an avalanche of post-it notes and spill-outs and file cards. So looking at stories that we've already seen referenced, we have these ones that tell fabulous stories, and each of those points resonate with each of those stories. But to look at ones that haven't perhaps hit that big time in that way, We've got something like Peter Pan. This started as a play in 1901 by J.M. Barrie and has been told as different iterations of Hook, I think in the 1980s, and Neverland in the 1990s. And equally, The Wizard of Oz. There's, I think, 10 different ways this has been told, from the initial book in 1900, I'm finished now, all the way through to even the latest movie that we have. So this is something that I run as part of Story Central Labs that I've been running with Mauricio, which is why I thought it would be kind of cool to mention it now. And just to remind you of these 5 things of story, which is a quote from Robert McKee. Story is about eternal universal forms and not formulas. Story is about archetypes, not stereotypes. Story is about thoroughness, not shortcuts. Mastering the art, not second-guessing the marketplace. Respect, not disdain for the audience. And originality, and not duplication. And that applies to storytelling, but it also applies to any approach you have to your audience and to transmedia storytelling. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison.
Thanks.
And I'm afraid we have time for just one very short question. Yes, right there.
Hello. I've been wondering, once you've created an immersive and gigantic world, for instance, like Star Wars, once you start allowing people to co-create and to add to the canon, what do you do as a storyteller once the canon starts conflicting with each other, when multiple co-creators you've actually inspired to make that canon start to conflict with each other?
Well, sometimes that could be quite good fun. But if you've set that core theme that's something that's very strong, usually the disruptors are put into place by the advocates and the evangelists. If you've set it up nicely that they're really, really strong with you. But if you find there's other iterations of the story that come out and they're conflicting, then usually you've got a situation where the fans handle that themselves. I mean, there's always that risk. That's always could happen, that you've got that going on. But that's why you have that story Bible with that core theme that all of your team know that's what it's all about. And it might mean you crafting additional storylines that kind of knock that out of place or challenge what they're saying. But that's where the playfulness comes in.
Thank you.
Thank
we
you.
have to leave it
That's
there
okay.
because we have to hand over the stage to Scott Trowbridge. Thank you.